So we're going to kick off this session with Katherine's talk. So just a little bit about Katherine. Katherine completed her bachelor's in linguistics and French in 2017 and her master's in linguistics in 2019, both at the University of Cologne. So during that time, and then up until March 2020, she worked as an assistant for projects headed by Nicolaas Himmelman and Birgit Helvig, working with data from the West Bomberai language Iha, which is spoken in West New Guinea, as well as the Binding language Kaket, which is spoken in East New Britain. She's also carried out fieldwork in Manokwari, West Papua, working with language consultants to transcribe and gloss data. Katherine's now early on in her PhD research. She started last year at the University of Amsterdam, and her PhD project is a typology of alternating verbs, which is carried out under the remit of the NWO project Exceptions Rule, Lexical Restrictions on Grammatical Structure, headed by Eva van Leer. So with that, I think that's what you're going to be talking a little bit about to us today. With that, I'll hand over to Katherine.
Thank you. I'll just share my presentation. So, should be sharing. Yeah, great. So yeah, as Laura just introduced, this is part of my PhD project at the University of Amsterdam, and this is the first case study within that. So I'm going to talk about alternating person indexing in Kamang. So I'll start off by introducing person indexing in the Timor-Alor-Pantar languages, and then go into the case study on Kamang. Yeah, so the person indexing in Timor-Alor-Pantar, we find ourselves, as Laura already said, in East Indonesia, but also partly in Timor-Leste. And it's a family of approximately 30 Papuan languages, and they're well known for their diverse morphological alignment systems. And what do we mean by person indexing in Timor-Alor-Pantar? Well, here's an example from Wersing, where you can see that you have the A argument, the P argument, and the verb. And on the verb, you have this index. Here it's just the person, but in other persons, you can have number as well. And there's various parameters of variation for these systems. So one of them is the number of prefix series that a language has, varying from 1 to 7. This is an example from Kamang. You can see there are 2 different prefixes on the 2 different verbs. So the A series on the verb see and the E series on the verb shoot. Another parameter of variation is there are verb classes. So not all verbs actually take indexation. So example 4 shows a verb hit, which takes 0 indexing. And on that theme of verb classes, there are classes where you have fixed prefixes and classes where the verbs actually alternate between a prefix and 0 or different prefixes. This is an example with the verb fafa, search for. And in the first example, you can see it's got the A series prefix. She kept looking for the child. And in example 6, it has 0 prefix when the 2 women search for each other's lice in turns. The final parameter of variation is the alignment system. So within the family, you've got very diverse systems ranging from syntactic to semantic. Here are just a couple of examples that I'll briefly go into now. So at the syntactic end, you have, for example, blagar, which has accusative alignment. So basically, you have no index for S arguments, and P arguments may be indexed. There's a lot of complexity about what may or may not be indexed, but accusative alignment. At the other end of the scale, a buoy has semantic alignment, where the P argument may be indexed again, but the S argument is split. So actors for intransitive verbs are not indexed on the verb, whereas for more undergoer-like arguments, they can be indexed on the verb. When you get more towards the middle of the scale, you get something like kaera, which has been described as having leaky accusativity. So in general, you get accusative alignment where P is indexed and S is not. But some verbs, they do index their S. And unlike with semantic alignment, that's not based on kind of actor-undergoer role. It's not based on being active or less or more of an undergoer, but in fact, it's kind of lexically specified. There's no particular semantic reason why I go up should not be indexed in the majority pattern, and you jump up is. And Kamang I've put more towards, so the semantic end of the scale. So again, P may be indexed, and you can see that more undergoer-like S's are indexed on the verb or can be indexed on the verb, such as in I'm hungry, whereas actor S's are not. So the child runs to his father. The verb tak here is run, and it's not indexed. It has no S index for the actor S. However, you might want to say that this is something like leaky semantic alignment, because in fact, that same verb tak can have a prefix on it. So here we have getak, where it was just tak before, and here it's quite an active event. So they ran away to another land, and they did that very intentionally. And so actually what you get is both actor and undergoer S's being indexed, but with some alternation. And it's that alternation that I'm interested in. So as we just saw for S, you can have alternation with the verb tak. So run can be both with this prefix or with no prefix. And P, as I showed in the example before, where you get fafa or just fafa. And so my question for the study is, which factors play a role in choosing which prefix or zero marking on alternating verbs? And I'm going to be exploring that in using a quantitative corpus study. But I'm very much not the first person to look into this. One of the reasons I wanted to use a quantitative corpus methodology was because there's already been some previous studies into this. So Fedden et al. 2013 and 14 took data using a video stimuli elicitation experiment, and then in 14 with additional corpus data. And what they found was kind of different depending on the different methodologies they used and the different angle you look at it. So they found that animacy was important or perhaps marginal in terms of animacy plus argument role. They found that if an S is indexed, it's animate or generally animate, whereas later can be animate or inanimate. For these different series, the O series, E series, A series, they found that for the O series, it was almost always P that was indexed. It favors inanimates, and it was the most frequent index. Whereas later, they mentioned that it's also used to index more affected S arguments. For the E series, that favors animates and can index P or S. And again, later, adding the fact that it can be affected S on motion and posture verbs. For the A series, again, favors animates and can index P or S. Both studies also talk about that lexical stipulation plays a role, as does effectiveness, volitionality, and telicity. So I'm taking another look at this with different methodology, as I said, looking at the alternating verbs only and looking at them in discourse. So I can look at the same factors. I'm not going to look at effectiveness, volitionality, and telicity. Instead, I can look at some discourse factors. So I'm going to look at the role of topicality in indexation and co-occurrence with independent arguments, which is relevant because in other Alor-Pantar languages, you actually do have complementary distribution between prefixes and independent pronouns. So in terms of the data I'm using, I've got an hour of spoken Kamang, and that consists of 10 monologues with a couple of different text types. Unfortunately, a very non-diverse speaker group of 3 speakers, all male, between 44 and 86. And that data was recorded and transcribed by Antoinette Schapper and George Sad between 2010 and 2020. And that's actually a subset of a larger corpus that they've made. And we annotated that with the GRAID annotation scheme, grammatical relations and animacy in discourse, which I'll describe a bit more about in a moment, and also the refined scheme in order to track discourse reference through the text. One of the nice advantages of using GRAID is that there are numerous languages in the multicast collection which are freely available, and so you can compare with those other languages, which I haven't done yet, but is in the pipeline. So basically, GRAID, the GRAID scheme allows you to add tags to arguments and predicates. And relevant here, SAP roles of the arguments, their animacy values. So there's various values, but today the only relevant distinction is really between animate, inanimate, with kind of some low animates patterning with inanimate. And then for independent arguments, they're tagged as being lexical MPs, as pronouns, or null. So they're null if it's a core argument that can be reconstructed from the context, that's clear from the context. For the indexed argument, so on the verb, we index the form of the prefix series, and also if there's no prefix, so if there's 0. Each argument is also then given a numeric ID to track it through the discourse. In terms of tagging the predicates, the only relevant thing here is that we're only looking at verbal predicates. So I mentioned before that languages have different numbers of prefixes. Kamang is actually at the extreme end with 7, but I'm actually only going to talk about 3 prefixes. They have been called different things in the literature before. I'm calling them A series, O series, and E series based on the form. So you can see there's na, no, ne, and hence A series, O series, E series. And the reason I'm only talking about those is because these other 4 are extremely rare, not just in our corpus, but in previous research as well. They come up very, very infrequently. And to be clear, when I talk about indexing strategies, I include 0 in that as a strategy. But of course, when I talk about prefixes, I'm just talking about the overt strategies. So on to the results. In our corpus, we had 164 verb types, of which 39 were alternating. And the definition of alternating is they occur with more than one marking strategy. And that seems like a low number, and that's, we can't read too much into that because there are a lot of verbs that only appear once, and of course, by definition, they can't alternate. It doesn't mean that they never do. It just means that they don't in this corpus, and so we're assuming that they're non-alternating and have a fixed strategy for the purposes of this study. To illustrate fafa again, which is a really nice example and comes up all the time. Fafa is an alternating verb because it occurs with the A series prefix and with 0. But later when we start talking about tokens, I'll talk about flexible markers. So this is a flexible A series token because it's not fixed. So there are, in this case, the A series is fixed. So on tac C, Leon sees me has an A series marker here, and he didn't see his shirt has an A series marker here. So whereas with fafa, you kind of have this animacy alternation where lice is not indexed, but the child is. With tac, you don't have that. And so we consider tac to be a non-alternating verb with fixed A marking. So from those 164 verbs, we get 797 tokens, and that excludes the minority prefix series that only occur a very small number of times. 48% of them are P indexes, and actually we can compare that with the study by Fedden et al. And we find that we have a similar rate of indexing animate Ps, so slightly lower in our study, but the difference, there's quite a big difference in inanimate Ps. So we only had 50% of inanimate Ps had a prefix So 50% have 0, whereas that was 70% in the previous study. So of those, out of these tokens, 356 of them are flexible. So that means they occur on alternating verbs. And the distribution of fixed and flexible differs for each series. So for 0, you have about 50-50 of fixed and flexible. Same for the O series, almost close to 50-50. The E series is actually more often flexible than fixed. And with the A series, you see that there's actually a really low number of flexible series. So just 26 items there. So yeah, basically A series is very, very often fixed to the verb and can't alternate. So of our alternating verb types, the question is, what do they alternate with? And the answer is generally 0. So 82% of the verbs that alternate with 0. So they were tested at least once with 0 marking. And then you get a decent number that alternate with E series and O series. And like we saw with the frequency of flexible A series, very few verbs. So just 8 verbs alternate with the A series. So essentially, in general, verbs have this alternation profile prefix plus 0, and generally alternate just between 1 prefix and 0 in our corpus, although some of them can alternate between a couple of different ones. So moving on to the factors that were looked at before. So first of all, to look at animacy, just in alternating verbs now. This is what we get. You can see some strong preferences for the A series and E series. So anima is the darker green-blue color at the bottom. So for A and O series, there's a preference for animate reference. For O series, there's it's very strongly prefers inanimate reference, and 0 is about 50-50. And this is about argument role, so whether the index is P or S. Again, we can see some strong preferences here, that the A series prefers P, but not that strongly. E series prefers S. 0 also prefers S. And the O series in our data actually only indexes P. And that raises the question, is it only indexing P because it adds P argument? So the answer is yes, it can do. So this is an example with the verb laka, hang. So in the first example, the dog wants the beehive that hangs there. So beehive that hangs, and hangs is 0 marked. Whereas in the second example, the bees are hanging in the tree. To add the tree as an additional argument, you can add the O series. But that's not the whole story, because you can also add the O series and it doesn't change the valency of the verb. So in the first example here, the sun and the wind are discussing their strengths. You have the verb kawaii, speak, with the O series, indexing the P argument strengths. And then you have, in the second example, mum, you go and speak to a woman. Kawaii, speak, again, here is not indexed, so it has a 0 index, indexing the P argument, a woman. So as a kind of intermediate summary, comparing animacy and argument role results with previous findings, animacy is pretty much what we expected. So these are the wrong way around. This should be the O series at the beginning that favors inanimates. This should be the A series, sorry about that, that favors animates. E series is in the correct place, that favors animates. 0, no preference. In terms of argument role, again, the O series here favors P, which was found before. A slight preference for P for the A series wasn't not found before, But what is new is this preference for S for the E series. So that wasn't reported before, but that comes out quite strongly in our data. And 0 doesn't have strong preferences apart from a slight preference for S, but that's not so discussed in the previous literature, the role of 0. But we want to go beyond animacy and argument role because it doesn't explain everything, basically. So latsi, the verb meaning stand, is attested 6 times in our data, 3 with the E series, 3 with 0. So in the first example here, you can see he stood on top of the stone, and latsi is indexed with the E series here. And we know that the E series prefers animate arguments, so perhaps you'd think that E series indexes animates and 0 indexes inanimates, but that turns out not to be the case. In the second example here, I went to stand at my maternal father's place. Stand here is 0 indexed, even though it indexes an animate referent, first person singular. So what we can gather from this is that latsi, the verb, has this profile that it can alternate, that it favors S arguments, and that it favors animate arguments. And that something else is going on something else has to explain this alternation. And here it looks like the alternation is based on whether there is an independent pronoun co-occurring in the clause. So in the first example, there is no pronoun, but you get the index. And in the second example, there is an overt first person singular pronoun and no index on the verb. So to go beyond animacy and argument role, we know that alternation is sensitive to animacy and argument role or argument role, and we want to look at these other factors, co-occurrence with independent arguments and topicality. So we want to analyze the effect of different factors while taking into account the lexical bias for animacy and argument role. So as I showed you the profile for latsi before, we actually give every verb a profile for argument role, SP and S or P, or a split SP, and the same for animacy. So favors animates, favors inanimates, or split. And our analysis we do with logistic regression modeling. So we made a multinomial model with a 4-level response variable. So the 4 levels are the 4 different indexing series we're looking at. So 0, E series, O series, or A series, and 0 is the baseline. So everything's compared to the baseline. 0 is the kind of default, and then you compare everything to that. And as I said, we have these argument role and animacy profiles for each verb, and we add that to the model as grouping factors, and that should capture verbal bias, allowing us to see the effect of factors beyond animacy and argument role. So for co-occurrence with independent arguments, the graph shows you the raw numbers, and then when I talk about significant effects, this is from the statistical model. So actually, this does have a significant effect, the realization of the independent argument. So all prefixes are significantly different from 0. And basically, we have the fact that there's a significant decrease in the rate of independent pronouns for all the prefixes compared to zeros. So if there's an independent pronoun in the clause, you're more likely to get a 0. And with the A series as well, we have a positive effect with null independent arguments. So moving on to topicality, there are various proxy measures for this. We're using topic persistence, which basically counts how many times the referent is mentioned in the next 10 clauses. So 10 is a high score and 0 is a low topicality score. And again, we find through our model that topicality does have a significant effect. So all series are different compared to 0. And again, we have O series with a kind of negative effect of topicality. So there's a significant increase in reference with low topicality compared to high topicality. So you're much more likely to get an O series index with lower topical reference. And then the opposite is true for the E and the A series. So you can see from the bars, that the dark purple, that's the more topical reference at the bottom. So we group them into 0, 1 to 2, and 3+ mentions in the next 10 clauses. And yeah, E and A basically are more likely to occur with higher topicality reference. A further discourse measure that we have is tracking function. So it's the use of a referential expression to track reference through discourse, which I've taken from the paper Riesberg et al., and that's been a big inspiration for this study in general. So basically, it's similar to topic persistence, but we take away the distance constraint. So whereas topic persistence says, how many times is this referent mentioned in the next 10 clauses, we say, is this referent mentioned again in the rest of the text at all? And here there's only one indexing strategy that showed a positive effect with tracked reference, and that's the E series. So you're significantly more likely to index a referent with an E series if it's going to be mentioned again. So just to explain the graph, the dark yellow is for tracked reference, so are they mentioned again? And the light yellow is they're not mentioned again. So if we take the results that we have and compare them to what previous studies found, in terms of animacy, we kind of show that, yes, it is important for prefix choice. In terms of S and animacy, we actually confirm again that it's generally animate if indexed. For the O series, we confirm that it almost always indexes P. In fact, for us, always indexes P. It favors inanimates. It's not the most frequent, but it's quite frequent. And actually, we're only looking at alternating verbs, so that's not really a fair comparison. For the E series, again, we confirm that it favors animates. And it actually doesn't favor, it doesn't index P and S equally. It much more favors S in our data. And that's actually the most flexible one, most frequent flexible one. For the A series, we've confirmed again that it favors animates. And we've shown that it has a slight preference for P, and that actually it is much more often fixed than flexible. So it doesn't occur very frequently on alternating verbs. We actually also find that lexical stipulation plays a role. So the fact that verbs only enter into one kind of alternation in general seems to be lexically fixed. There doesn't seem to be any semantic motivation for which prefix a verb takes in many cases. And then one difference we found with the previous studies is the rate of non-zero P prefixes is much lower in our data, so in the discourse data than in the video stimuli elicitation data. To go now to alternation patterns. So basically 0 is this default that most verbs take 0, and if they alternate, they then occasionally take one of these 3 prefixes. Some verbs enter into more than one of these patterns. So for example, Kamang takes 0 marking, A series and E series, and this shows the high degree of lexical stipulation within the system, because this is entirely lexically based, the choice between these strategies. For the A series 0 alternation, this is kind of very infrequent, only occurs on 5 verbs. Some of it can be explained in terms of animacy triggered differential object marking. So when you have an animate P and you lift it up, you index the P on the verb, and if it's inanimate, you don't index it. But that doesn't explain everything. And so what we found in this study is that the prefix, the A series prefix has a preference for more topical reference and a preference for null independent arguments and a dispreference for pronouns. For the O series, that's a bit more productive. There's 12 verbs that enter into this alternation. Some of it can be explained in terms of valency increase. So I already showed you before, lacquer hang and wolaka, hang on something. And there's another example here with kete, eat. So eat or eat with someone. There's also some animacy triggered differential object marking in the opposite way to the A series. So when you discuss with someone, there's 0 marking, and when you discuss something, there's the O series. And again, that doesn't explain everything. And so we add the fact that the prefix, the O series prefix, prefers less topical reference and has a dispreference for co-occurring in the clause with an independent pronoun. The E series, again, is quite productive, 12 verb types, and it's the most frequent prefix that we find in alternating verbs, and seems to be for alternating animate S marking. There's no animacy triggered differential argument marking that we can find, and so what it's doing is not entirely clear at this point. What we do know is that it has a preference for more topical reference, for tract reference, and a dispreference for appearing in a clause with independent pronouns. In the literature, there is talk of this being for affectedness, and that may well be the case. We didn't look at that, but we also found examples where affectedness doesn't explain it. So in the example at the very beginning with TAC, where people were running very much of their own volition and it was indexed. So brief summary. 0, what we found is that 0 is the most common strategy for alternating verbs in discourse. We confirm the importance of animacy and alternation that was already found in previous studies, and the kind of great importance of animacy.
We lost Catherine. And anyone else? Is it just me, or is that for everybody?
Me too.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Just as she was going to stick the landing.
That's right. Give her a second so she comes back. Okay. She seems to be out. Give a minute, see if she rematerializes. Just while we're waiting, I've just had news. So I think that there have been issues with connectivity in Gathertown earlier today. That was a worldwide Gathertown outage. They managed to time it precisely for our conference, but they have been tweeting about it, and apparently it now should be resolved. So if you were experiencing difficulties, that was everybody, and hopefully everything should be resolved now. Okay, Catherine. Do you want to just finish off that slide, and then we'll head to the Q&A?
So you heard me up to summary, right?
Up to the second point of the summary. Yeah, that's right.
Good stuff. Okay. You need to let me share my screen. Thanks. So yes, where was I? I think I just said that there were small pockets of systematic alternation, and then what we found out with this study is that prefixes are less likely when independent pronouns are present in the clause, and that prefixes are split in terms of topicality preferences, with E and A preferring more topical reference and the O series preferring less topical reference. And then it just remains for me to thank not only the Kamang people, who unfortunately I haven't had the chance to meet yet, but the rest of the team. So George Sad was the corpus consultant, Clemens Meyer did a lot of the annotation, Pega Fagiri did most of the statistical analysis, and Eva van Leer helped in many and various ways. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Catherine. So we have about 8 minutes for questions. As before, if anybody has any questions, just type Q in the chat or type your question out and I'll read it out. While people are gathering their thoughts, Catherine, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this feeds into the NWO project more generally.
Yeah, so we're kind of doing it backwards because we should have started with the typological part and then the case studies, but it so happens that we're starting with the case study. So the idea is that we're going to look at several languages for kind of lexically specified alternations. So as you hopefully gathered from the presentation, there's a lot of lexical specification going on in Kamang, where most of it can't be explained with systematic kind of valency change or differential argument marking, but hopefully we're going to find some clusters of verbs that tend to be fixed or tend to enter into kind of lexically specified alternations.
Great, thank you. Don's got a question.
Yeah, thanks. This was really cool stuff. I have a small question and a big question, and I'll just ask the small question because the big question is kind of unfair. I was wondering about co-occurrence of these different prefixes. So you showed us all of these different prefixes, or prefix sets rather, and then said that 4 of them are very infrequent. But I noticed that example 13 had the SBEN, I don't know what that means, with the O series. So how common is that? Which kinds can co-occur and what does it mean?
Yeah, so SBEN is self-benefactive, and actually that's supposed to be in a different, it's in a different slot in the verb template. So the P and S marking prefixes are closest to the verb, and the self-benefactive is kind of one further away. And actually self-benefactive isn't usually in the person marking paradigm list because it's in this different slot and has a different role. But for 1 or 2 verbs, it actually does mark the P argument. So I've included it, but then discounted it again because it's so infrequent. So that's the SBEN. There is a question mark over the O series, which it can be a P prefix in this slot, but it also occurs in the same form. So it could be a different prefix in a slot further away from the verb, so in front of SBEN, I think. And there it has various different meanings that I haven't looked into. And so there is actually a question mark when you get the O series. Is it a P marking prefix, or is it this other thing that does things like doing an action back again? But yeah, that's a topic. That's a topic for another day. That's a big question. Thanks.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions? George has got his hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that, Laura. It's great to see all this coming together. Really lovely stuff. I wanted to get your thoughts on 2 things. Firstly, the first one concerns the table where you compared this study to the Fedden et al. Study. So my first question is, what do you think this tells us about? I mean, some of the findings were quite different. So what do you think this tells us generally about how the system works in Kamang in kind of an integrated way? This would be the first one. Then the second one is about the O prefix, because it was quite interesting to see what kind of correlated with it, namely low topicality and adding valency to a verb. Do you feel like this could have any theoretical implications? Like, could there be a link between, 2 of these factors or some of the other factors you found which correlate with these prefixes? Is this a one-off, or is this a kind of a common cross-linguistically? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so to your first point, what have we found that's different? I mean, unfortunately, what I was hoping for with this study and what everyone hopes for when they do a study is that they can explain everything and they have a wonderful system where everything's explained and there's no loose ends. But actually what the study does is we just add another little bit of the puzzle that had already been started to be put together by other studies. So we confirmed some things, we sent some things in a slightly different direction, then we added this stuff about co-occurrence restrictions, which haven't been talked about before because they're not in complementary distribution, it's just a trend. It's a statistical preference that they don't like to co-occur with pronouns, but in other languages, that's really in complementary distribution. So that was interesting that we kind of see some of that in Kamang. And then the topicality stuff, which is, feeds into your next question about the O series. I mean, it was originally described as a locative prefix. And this would kind of suggest that it does have this role, right? But I mean, locations tend to be, not so topical, not mentioned so frequently. And so it does occasionally have this adding a location role. Cross-linguistically, I can't answer that question yet, but come back to me in a year or two.
I suppose the applicativizing function / the locative function, that is maybe, that co-occurs, and that's common cross-linguistically. But yeah, the fact that the link between topicality and, let's say, valency, I feel like that's quite an interesting one. Let's see what comes out of it. Thanks.
Thanks.
We've probably got time for one more very quick question or comment, if anyone's got anything there you'd like to say. Nicolas, yeah.
Just further clarification with this co-occurrence restrictions, which I didn't get in the talk. You said they don't like to occur with pronouns. That's kind of intuitively not surprising. What about full NPs? Is that different, or why are you emphasizing pronouns in that statement?
Because the only significant effect for all of the prefixes versus 0 was just for co-occurrence with pronouns. Only one series showed a significant effect of not being realized at all. So only the A series also doesn't like being with an NP in the clause as well. But the O series and E series, there was no effect of MPs.
That's interesting, but I guess you should check that really for whether that's really true, because I mean with more data, etc. I mean that maybe there's always some kinds of biases in your data which may lead to that. So what you would expect is no liking of co-occurrences, basically, as long as it's kind of it has its own referentiality. Once it has become an agreement marker, then of course there shouldn't be big effects in that regard. Anyways, very interesting thing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, so thank you, Katherine, again.